So hi, I'm Hazel. I want to say it's really nice to be a part of this debate, even though I'm just doing the minutes. A minute speech is something quite traditional. I'll just explain what it is for those of you who haven't been here before. It's just an introduction. It's supposed to set the tone for the rest of the debate. Often we do some jokes to warm everyone up for chamber. Obviously, this is a very serious topic. I don't want to do it or our excellent speakers tonight any disservice. So instead of a stand-up routine, though I'm really good at those, I just wanted to talk about a writer who I like, Ernst Becker. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Denial of Death, a book he wrote in 1973. And there's this line that I really like that he has in it. He says, "What does it mean to be a self-conscious animal? The idea is ludicrous, if not monstrous. It means to know that one is food for worms." And when we debate and we have discourse, it's really easy to think that we're not food for worms, right? Becker said that societal conflict is dictated by this monstrous idea, because the way that we lead our lives, we all have these different points of view, and we all scramble to just pull people over to our side, however that may be. And we see this as an immortality formula. We want to live on through our legacy. If our ideas have influence, we can avoid the monstrous reality of death, wherever death takes us. I don't claim to know where death takes us, and I don't think that anyone here tonight is hoping to become immortal by the end of the debate. But I do believe that Becker was right, because death, or at the very least, our perceptions of death, right? I believe that's fundamental to discourse. And that's just why I'm really glad that we're debating this motion tonight. I have every faith that it's going to be a really informative, respectful, and just excellent debate. And yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
I feel like the bar was set very high just now. Hold on, sorry. Let me get my shit together. All right. We are here today to debate the legalization of assisted dying. The question most often posed in the discussion and debate on this topic is, does it help alleviate some people's suffering and allow for a more peaceful end to their life? The answer obviously being yes, but that's not the only question we should be asking before agreeing to the legalization of an ill-conceived and overly simple assisted dying legislation. The question we should be asking is, are we capable of creating assisted dying policy that doesn't treat the lives of disabled people as expendable and does not pressure those in vulnerable situations to save themselves and their families from medical costs? To which the answer has been a clear and resounding no. When looking at the proposed assisted dying bill in the DAW, the continued problems with legislating the legalization of assisted dying are clear. According to the language of this bill, a person is considered a qualifying person if their medical condition meets one of two eligibility criteria. Either they are diagnosed with a terminal illness defined as a condition that is incurable and irreversible, and in the opinion of two independent medical practitioners, is expected to lead to death within a specified time frame, or they are experiencing unbearable suffering that cannot be alleviated to a level the person finds acceptable, even with the best palliative care available. Although assisted dying has frequently been presented in the Irish media as a policy limited to only those with terminal illness, though even the law's definition of this leaves much to be desired, it's clear that the legislation extends far beyond assisted dying for the terminally ill. When I spoke about this topic with the Phil 2 years ago, my chronic illness qualified me for euthanasia in more than half of the states where it is offered. Under the proposed law in Ireland, despite the fact that my diagnosis has no impact on life expectancy, I would have qualified as well. Though there are treatment options available to me in the US that were able to greatly reduce my symptoms, I have been limited to treatment. I would have been limited under this law to the options available to me in Ireland, which do not include a single treatment for my condition, and thus I would have continued to qualify. Thus, assisted dying would have remained on the table, and perhaps if I had suffered the same symptoms I was suffering then for long enough, I would have considered it. What wouldn't have been on the table, though, is medical marijuana, which is currently only available to 47 people in the entire country with only 3 conditions. What does it say about our view of disabled people if we are more willing to end their lives than expand the pain relief options available to them? All over the world, in countries which have legalized assisted dying, medical systems have proved just how little they are truly willing to do to alleviate the suffering of disabled people, and just how readily they will accept that living with a disability is a fate worse than death. Just a few of the diagnoses that are qualified for individuals for assisted dying in countries where it is legal are autism, trauma resulting from childhood abuse, anorexia, and blindness, for which euthanasia was granted to a Dutch woman because she, quote, could not stand not being able to see the stains on her clothes. Another reason cited for why a patient's suffering qualified them for assisted dying was that because of her personality, she was in constant conflict with those around her. These qualification standards are also reliant on how their doctors assess suffering and the value they assign to disabled people's lives. Research from across the world has shown just how little doctors value disabled people's lives when compared to that of able-bodied people. There is evidence that doctors make more rapid and premature life and death decisions in cases involving disabled people, and research finds that those with intellectual disabilities are less likely to be resuscitated than those without. This valuation of some lives over others extends beyond disability. Further research has indicated that doctors view the quality of life of racial and ethnic minorities as worse than that of white people. It's troubling to think that the people who hold these beliefs are the very same people evaluating who does and does not have the right to die. It's hard when hearing this not to think back to the use of euthanasia as a tool to eradicate so-called undesirables from society. It was this way of thinking that led to the extermination of 300,000 people with physical and mental illnesses, many of them children, by the Nazis. Though this is undeniably the most extreme modern case, this way of thinking was not limited to Nazi Germany. In the 1940s in the United States, the president of the American Neurological Association argued that disabled people should be relieved of the burden of living by way of euthanasia. While language surrounding assisted dying has become much less extreme in the years since, the standards for qualification for assisted dying across the world make it clear that this sentiment remains, and in many ways, modern assisted dying laws are just eugenics and prettier packaging. The very use of the term death with dignity to describe assisted dying implies the views of many in society that is more dignified to die than live with a disability. Coupled with the view of disabled lives as less than is the idea that chronically ill people are a financial burden. This manifests in a view of assisted dying as a cost-saving measure to families and health systems. This has resulted in a growing concern that patients may be pressured to elect for assisted dying over treatment or palliative care. We have seen these concerns realized in the case of one woman in Oregon who, after applying for insurance coverage for a drug to treat her lung cancer that her doctor told her might save her life, was told that they would not cover this drug, but they would cover the physician-assisted death pill. These problems are not, however, concentrated in the money-motivated American healthcare system. One Canadian man cited being tired of fighting for compassionate care rather than his illness as the primary reason he elected for assisted death. He was still approved. Another was asked repeatedly of his interest in medically assisted suicide and told when he refused that he would either be charged $1,500 a day to remain in the hospital or return home and be given care by a government provider that had previously given him food poisoning and abandoned him injured and alone in his home. A third man claimed that he opted for assisted death because he was unable to afford a life worth living as a result of inadequate care and support for his disability. Though the DAL did express concern for the exploitation of vulnerable groups in its report on the legalization of assisted dying, appropriate safeguards against coercion are not actually present in the most recent assisted dying legislation, which is only about 5,000 words in total. Given the complicated nature of assisted dying, it would be impossible to effectively legislate assisted dying with all the appropriate safeguards in such few words. I mean, my dissertation is longer than that. This, coupled with the view of the TD that authored the legislation that many of the public's concerns regarding the bill were unhelpful, suggests that we may not be able to trust the DAL to make policy decisions in the best interests of vulnerable groups in this instance. In all, I think our conversations surrounding assisted dying should be centered more around the feasibility of accomplishing effective and protective legislation rather than the vague notions of morality. Thank you.
If I was to ask you all if life had benefits, I would assume that I'd receive a resounding yes. Every positive experience we as humans can enjoy comes from being alive. and ethicists of both the medical and general varieties tend to agree with this. It's why we praise those who save lives and punish those who take them away. But this is not a fully rounded analysis of life. To say life is the best thing of all, full stop, and to leave it there would ignore an important minority in our society and the most important stakeholders in this debate, those who wish to avail of assisted dying. To grant these people their wish and make assisted dying available to them would go against this most basic principle that life is best. So how then do we on side opposition justify this? By focusing on reality, not theory. By approaching these cases with nuance and having the ability to agree with them when they say their life can no longer yield benefits. So who then are the kind of people who are advocating for assisted dying? They're patients who suffer from terminal diseases such as MS and ALS that will not improve and only worsen to a level of suffering that is incomprehensible for those of us lucky enough not to experience it. Take Marie Fleming, for example. Miss Fleming is perhaps the most well-known Irish advocate of assisted dying. Prior to her death, she required assistance to be washed, to be dressed, to be repositioned in her wheelchair, to eat and to drink. She had lost all control of her bladder and lacked the ability to move her own wheelchair. She suffered from extreme pain in her eyes, head, temples, neck, back, arms, hands, hips, and legs. This was despite being on the maximum dosage of painkillers that wouldn't kill her. On top of all of this, she retained full cognitive function, being fully aware of her condition, its worsening state, and her impending death. This not only shows the desperation that we are discussing tonight, but also the true meaning of benefit. I'm not only talking about the ability to watch a sunset on the beach or to graduate from university, but the ability to stand, the ability to talk, the ability to exist without pain. Now, while those first two complex examples I mentioned are beneficial, they're not central to the human experience. They are the more simple ones that I said, things like that, they make up our sense of dignity, our sense of humanity. To lose these, and to consciously lose these, is a fate I don't think any of us would wish on our worst enemy. No, thank you. So when these advocates say their life has lost any of its benefits, I think we show them that we see their experiences and take them at their word. From here, I think the debate becomes one of scale. Assisted dying is a powerful and possibly dangerous system to put into place. So how then do we justify these risks? I think for the same reason that we justify its existence. The level of suffering that these people are experiencing is of terribly epic proportions. Our modern health system has failed them, and for once it's not for reasons of efficiency or bureaucracy, but because we simply haven't made the scientific advancements to discover medicine to cure or effectively alleviate their suffering. As a society, we have the opportunity to do something for people who have had everything taken from them. To give them the last shred of control over their lives and their future. I think the dignity and agency this provides is moral justification enough to introduce assisted dying into our society. I'll take in just a sec. However, I also think there are practical steps that will reduce the risk that I'll discuss after the point.
Would you limit assisted dying only to the terminally ill and those in pain, or would you allow it for everyone?
I'd limit it to the terminally ill and only those in pain, which is kind of the standard that comes up when we discuss assisted dying. So, legalization implies a lot of things. It implies systems, and it implies structure. We can expect safeguards and limitations to the practice, things to protect against duress and pressure. Now, of course, a truly effective system to ensure these things would require a lot of resources. But, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, these people's lives and dignity justify this. The only major risk that I do see in relation to this legalization is the floodgates argument. That if we were to legalize it, it would go beyond what I've been discussing about the people in the most extreme circumstances and trickle down to less and less extreme instances. And that will then obviously, by being more available, lead to more death, which is bad. But I do think this is possible, but I don't think the harm that it causes is as bad as the proposition may raise. A widened criteria doesn't mean lessened safeguards. It doesn't mean more duress. It would also not mean a sudden shift in society's view on death. I don't think the availability of assisted dying makes it a generally attractive option. To say that people who want to avail of assisted dying right now isn't even entirely correct. Of course, I can't speak for these people, but I do think if there was any other option to stop their suffering, they would take it. All mentally sound people see the value in their own lives and the value in the lives of others. So if assisted dying were to be legalised, I don't think we'd stop seeing all deaths as a tragedy. But I do think it would help us to recognise that for some, an assisted death is the best of a number of truly terrible options. In doing so, we give some sense of power back to the most powerless in our society. And this is the most important power of all, the power over yourself and your future. I'll wrap up on a quote from Gloria Taylor, a Canadian assisted dying advocate. I live in apprehension that my death will be slow, difficult, unpleasant, painful, undignified, and inconsistent with the values and principles that I have tried to live by. Everyone should have the power to live by the values they choose. This power should never be taken away. Through the legalisation of assisted dying, we have the opportunity to give people this most basic and fundamental power back. Proud to oppose.
There are two principal arguments against the motion before the House tonight. One is that the one that Owen has just very eloquently advanced, that we need to legalise assisted dying in order to prevent unbearable suffering for some people. There's a second argument as well, which he didn't talk about so much, but is important here, and that is a philosophical argument that we should each be free to choose the manner and timing of our own death. It's an argument about autonomy and an argument about freedom. So let me say something about both of these. They're powerful arguments, both of them, but I don't think they deliver what this motion or opposing this motion actually requires. So let's think for a minute about suffering and pain. So we're all going to die at some point, and as Owen said, life has a great value for all of us as when we live it well. But when we stop and think for a minute, I imagine we would all want, when it comes, a death that's peaceful and pain-free for us and those we love. My mother, who was from Kerry, died of stomach cancer at the age of 71. She was at home, she had excellent palliative care, she was on a titrated morphine drive. And the night before she died, she turned to my sister, who was putting chairs around her bed, and said, "What are you expecting, a theatrical performance?" And she was dead 24 hours later. It was a good death. And I bet everybody in this room may have experiences and will have experiences of deaths. Not all of them are as straightforward as that. And for many people, death can be a very difficult thing. And experiencing somebody else's death a very difficult thing. One of the reasons for this is the very patchy, in the UK, I don't know what the situation is in Ireland, but in the UK, there's a very patchy provision of palliative care. In some places it's excellent, but in many cases it isn't. Hospitals are also bad places to die. They're not good at dealing with the dying. Doctors are trained to think of death as a failure, and often through risk of feeling that they may be accused of neglect, they will over-treat somebody who's dying when actually what they need is palliative care. And I don't know if there are any medical students here, but the amount of time that medical trainees spend on death and dying and palliative care is a tiny, tiny fraction of medical training. So we don't think hard about providing the best possible care and palliative care. Palliative care experts like Professor Elora Finlay argue that very many of the hard cases where people die in great pain and distress can be very significantly ameliorated by excellent palliative care. But it's not just about pain. Often it's the distress caused by a sense of powerlessness and dependency on others. Now, for some years, my wife was a counsellor at a hospice, and she had one guy who had been a successful business person. He was in control. His family looked up to him. He was the guy who made all the decisions. For him, dependency was something he just couldn't come to terms with at all. But through a process of counselling, he did come to terms with it in some sense and reached some acceptance of that. So often it's a process that takes time. And I think the evidence is also that they're not very good at predicting how we are all going to feel over time in different circumstances. We don't easily imagine ourselves in the future as to how we will feel. And we had a friend who had motor neuron disease, which is a horrible disease, and he wanted to die. He was super clear, I want to go. And if the law had allowed me, I would have done it. 6 months later, he said, do you know what? I'm so glad that wasn't here, because the last 6 months I've had with my daughters, my 3 daughters and my wife, are so valuable. And I'm very, very glad I had them. So, what am I arguing? I'm arguing that universal palliative care, excellent palliative care, is crucially needed, and together with more discussion in societies about death and dying, that will go a long way to addressing the fear that this feeds this argument. But I accept there are still hard cases, there are diseases that palliative care can't meet, and also, regardless of that, some people have a very clear, settled view that it's my life, and I should be able to end it as and when I want. And this philosophical argument I want to say a word about now, because in a way I think this goes to the heart of this question. It's the principle of autonomy. And that principle, in this context, comes up against the most fundamental principle of law, enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and elsewhere, namely the duty of the state and of each of us to protect the right to life. The law against intentional killing is, in the words of Professor John Finnis, who's Professor of Jurisprudence at Oxford, a thin, bright line. It's thin because it's narrow. It's a very narrow, clear definition of what the law is. And it's a bright line because it points to and reflects a boundary that exists in the state to protect the individual and to protect us from the state and to protect all life. Once you cross that boundary, yeah.
But it's not the state that chooses to kill someone if they opt into assisted dying. It's you who signs the papers, who does all the tests, and ends up choosing to do it yourself.
Well, you are requiring, if the law in the UK goes through, the state to assist you to do it. The UK will have to set up a national assisted dying service if the law before the House of Commons goes through in order to carry out. So yes, it's done at the request of, but it's actually a death delivered by the state. It's a national assisted dying service which will sit alongside the National Health Service that, if our legislation goes through, will be built up. I don't know what will happen in the Ireland case, but that's what will happen in the UK if that's what we create. So I think that line, that thin, bright line, is crossed if we do this. And we're left then in a decision of constructing another boundary, or lots of boundaries, and that's really hard. It's not that there's a slippery slope here. It's that there's an edge. The thin, bright line is an edge. It's a super clear foundational principle of law. And once you go beyond that, there's loads of ambiguity about where you should draw lines in society. And that's why, in those countries that have legalized assisted dying, the boundaries are continually shifting. If you look at Canada, for instance, which legalized assisted dying in 2016, it was for the terminally ill only. In 2021, it was extended to not just terminally ill people, but also those with chronic illness. It's now been passed in Canada, that's from 2027, it will be available for people with severe mental illness. So in Canada, which is an extreme case, you've had this extraordinary shift. But it's also changing in other areas in the States and in Australia as well, which are cited by the UK Parliament certainly as much better examples. But in both cases, actually, the law is changing. We can talk about that if people want to ask exactly what some of the detail is about what is going on in those different jurisdictions. So there's a dynamic. Once you've done this, it shifts and it doesn't stay still. And the reason it doesn't stay still is because of autonomy. It's because of the argument that people come back to and say, well, hang on a minute. If there's a right to die for you, why isn't it there for me? And if I've got a disability and the law says that those who have less than 6 months to live can have terminal illness, can avail themselves of assisted suicide, why can't I? I want to do it. Yeah.
Why is that a bad thing?
Well, that's a good question. Why is it a bad thing? Because I think, and this goes to the heart of the question. So the issue is, if we accept that, because on the face of it, you're right. You might say, well, hang on a minute, you're arguing about autonomy. Wouldn't it be better if we all did have autonomy? And then we can all choose the timing and manner of our own deaths. The problem with this is that while it's superficially very attractive, we have to think through the deep value change and the long-term consequences of society. So when we think about death and the right to die, we come face to face with the question of what we expect of a society, of a community, and of each other. and culture will change over time, and we lose the crucial safety of a law which says that every human life has an intrinsic value. And although, yes, you might say, well, surely if it's just a choice, that doesn't affect anything else. Well, I think the answer is over time it will, and it does. And that's why the main opponents in the UK of assisted dying legislation, the two groups, the palliative care medics are 80% against it. They're the people who deal with the people who are dying all the time. The other group that's most vociferous is disability rights groups. Those are the two main groups. Why are disability rights groups against this? Because they see that the consequence of this legislation over time will be the devaluing of their lives. And there will be an encroachment because no longer does the law fundamentally say human life in and of itself has a unique value and dignity. So changing the law to legalise assisted dying does change the relationship of the citizen and the state. And in the UK, as I said, if the current law is passed, the government will be committed to establishing a national assisted dying service. Though goodness knows where that's going to happen and how it will be funded. In my last minute, I want to say a word about money. In the UK, in the next 20 years, there will be a massive transfer of wealth from the baby boomer generation, people like me and older than me, to our children. And there's a massive shift, and I suspect the same may be true in Ireland, that basically an awful lot of the money in the last 30 years is tied up with old people. And the people in their 30s and 40s in the UK and here probably are much less well off than they were a generation ago. There's enormous economic pressure that's going to be there. My wife, before she was a counsellor, ran a series of care homes. She had people coming up to her saying, can't you help things along? Because this person is costing $1,000 a week and we want to inherit all this money. Coercion, soft coercion from good people who feel they may be a burden will be a factor here. And people feeling that they should just go in order for the money for their children. Self-coercion, not imposed by anybody else, but imposed on oneself. So please think about that. I would urge you to support the motion.
Yes, indeed. This is an issue of profound ethical and human significance. But I haven't heard one word mentioned, and that's voluntary. It is voluntary assisted dying. It is not any other kind of assisted dying. So why can't people mind their own business? That's what I'm going to talk about here. Autonomy and free will are human rights. To deny autonomy has a whiff of totalitarianism about it, or oppression of minority rights. This is not a debate about politics, but it's about compassion, dignity, and the fundamental right of individuals to make decisions about their own lives, especially in the face of unbearable suffering. And those with contrary religious beliefs, or anyone who doesn't want voluntary assisted dying, you need not apply, so don't be afraid. This debate is about compassion. We wouldn't force an animal to endure unrelenting pain, yet we deny mercy to our fellow human beings. Every day, doctors, nurses, and palliative care specialists bear witness to the excruciating pain suffered by many with terminal illnesses. Many of these medical professionals do their utmost to manage symptoms, but there are cases where medicine reaches its limits, where the only thing left is suffering without reprieve. No person should have to endure agony against their will. Voluntary assisted dying provides a pathway, allowing them to die peacefully, surrounded by loved ones at a time of their choosing. Now, we value personal autonomy in every aspect of life, whether in decisions about our education, our relationships, or our bodies. How then can we deny autonomy to those who seek to control the most personal decision of all, the manner in which they die? Now, Ireland, as we've heard, is not alone in considering assisted dying. Canada, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of the United States and Australia, and now New Zealand have introduced this legislation with their safeguards. And what does this give us? It gives us a huge data set for our academics to look over, to see whether or not these arguments of slippery slopes or euthanasia and all these other conditions are robust or not. These laws in these countries have proven that it is possible to protect the vulnerable while also respecting the rights of the terminally ill to make informed choices about their own lives. The fear that such laws lead to abuse is unfounded. Apart from the religious argument, which says that suffering takes you closer to God, which should not be the determinant of our laws, the main argument against assisted dying is the slippery slope argument. This holds that the controls on assisted dying will inevitably be loosened over time, and people, particularly those in vulnerable groups, will be pressurized into agreeing to an assisted death. There have been extensive and well-respected studies, both at the University of Glasgow and at the London School of Economics, that tell us that disabled groups are no more vulnerable because of this. And also, the slippery slope is often used cynically by those who outright oppose assisted dying. Here in Ireland, we've already demonstrated our ability to have difficult but necessary conversations about our personal rights. And I look around the room and I see many people under the age of 50. You might be unaware that in 1992, suicide was illegal here. So was any homosexual act. Divorce was not permitted. Contraception was banned. Many people took what was called the contraception train to Belfast to buy contraception, to come back and have it seized and be arrested in order to raise this issue. All of these things carried the penalty of incarceration and stigma. Homosexuality, contraception and divorce, it couldn't happen here. It needed a popular referendum and a movement. Suicide is now decriminalised, but assisting someone to die by suicide carries a 14-year prison sentence. Potentially, even helping someone to travel to a foreign jurisdiction to end their life is a crime prosecutable under law. We've just heard, leading up to the recent abortion debate, of many women who got the boat, a euphemism to travelling to the UK for an abortion. With the UK set to legalise voluntary assisted dying, we don't want our contemporary version to send citizens to another jurisdiction only to have their remains repatriated later. We cannot force people to get the boat again. We have modernised our laws on marriage equality and reproductive rights, always moving in the direction of compassion and personal freedom. The same principles apply here. With some 3/4 of Irish adults now in favour of voluntary assisted dying, now is the time to introduce it. Our healthcare professionals should not have to stand by powerless as patients plead for relief that is beyond their reach. Our families should not have to watch their loved ones fade in agony. Most importantly, our citizens should not be denied the right to end their suffering with dignity. Now we have a choice. We can either continue to turn away from the suffering of those who are pleading for the right to die on their own terms, or we can stand with them in compassion and solidarity. We can give them the dignity of choice, the relief from pain, and the freedom they deserve. Voluntary assisted dying is not about imposing death. It is about offering a choice to those who have no other options, a choice that affirms the fundamental values of autonomy, dignity, and compassion. I'll take that.
Why limit this choice to only the terminally ill? Would you also extend it to other people?
In Canada, they are extending it, and there is some merit in that, because you can, for example, if you're diagnosed with a disorder that is going to take away your personality and your mind in a few years' time, you can specify that you don't want that, and at a certain time you will wish to activate it. So that is all possible. It is wrong that only those with the means and courage to travel to a foreign jurisdiction are able to exercise this choice. It creates a two-tier system that we are so against. We in Ireland should join the increasing number of countries who have legislated for assisted dying for the terminally ill and incurably suffering. Evidence shows that the majority of people who chose to die have exhausted the palliative care measures available. Others know that they may have an assisted death, but they choose not to do it. 1/3 of people cash in their prescriptions but never use them. Far away.
Does this not suggest that people accepted the possibility of assisted dying before they had been presented all the options to them, and the reason they changed their mind so late is because they weren't weren't provided those options early enough?
No, it's not about providing it late. They choose their time and their place, and they avail of it in advance, or they can put forward their case before they need to do it. But the safeguards are there. The safeguards are there that you need medical professionals to sign off on this, and it takes more than one. And what happens if you've got more than one person doing anything? If you've got more than one person involved in this, they have their reputations. They face sanctions themselves. It's a very tight system. It hasn't broken so far in those countries that have availed of it. Look, we'd all like a natural, peaceful death, and we all hope for that. But when that option is not a possibility, which of us would not like to know that if our suffering became unbearable, the option of a voluntary, assisted, painless death is open to us? The majority of Irish people, that's who thinks this. And let's make this a reality. Let's show Ireland and the world that we're a nation that listens, a nation that cares, and a nation that respects the rights of its citizens to live and die with dignity.
When I die, I want to be cremated, and when I'm diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I'm booking the next flight to Switzerland, is what my mother says every time, without fail, at the end of the night, after one too many glasses of Pinot Grigio, or whatever that is. That time in the evening after being with family or friends, when that sudden looming reality of death descends upon you. If my mother were sitting here, and she's told me, she would be the first person to put her hand up with a POI as I nervously look up and politely say, "No, thank you." Her mother, my grandmother, died of Alzheimer's, a slow and painful death. She forgot herself, her loved ones, her daughter, me. She couldn't dress herself, feed herself, or bring herself to the bathroom. I say this to remind you, I am not ignorant or naive to the realities of why someone would want to die this way. I am not ignorant or naive to how this could be a positive, safe relief from the pain an individual is experiencing. I have seen it firsthand, and believe me, I know. If the systems of assisted dying, that being an individual being prescribed medication which will end their life, could be a perfect system, if there was certainty that there would be no mistakes, no errors, I could support it. I respect and can even agree with a lot of opposition's points. I am not coming from a faith-based moral purity standpoint, honestly the opposite. Generally, I respect people's autonomy and the right to make decisions about their own body. If I thought that this was the debate at hand, then I would be sitting there, but I'm not. I'm here because no assistive dying systems or laws can be 100% safe. No amount of safeguards can instill enough confidence in me in these systems. And you could argue that they work, but they don't, and I will get to that. Most of the time, assisted dying begins as being introduced just for the terminally ill with a prognosis of less than 6 months. If assisted dying could be kept to that small and arguably right criteria to give someone dignity in their death, then there would be no debate. Expansion of that law is inevitable. This is not a hypothetical situation or an abstract slippery slope argument or floodgates argument. This is reality. Countries with legalized assisted dying like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada, which I can accept is an extreme case, have expanded beyond terminal illnesses to cases like psychiatric conditions and non-life-threatening suffering. One could argue that assisted dying is better than someone self-harming or taking multiple attempts at their own life. And I could see that. The suffering would be over, wouldn't it? But do you know what's better than someone self-harming and then assisting them to die? Proper and serious investment in mental health services and our healthcare system as a whole. And if you're sitting there rolling your eyes, probably thinking, I've been through CAMS, I've seen the healthcare system, that is unrealistic. How can you trust the same government who makes those systems, who reinforces those policies, who leaves healthcare workers understaffed, underpaid, overworked, to instate this delicate, complex, and sensitive system? If palliative care, healthcare, and mental health supports is done and done right, then the need for assisted dying could be significantly reduced. I am not and cannot claim that palliative care or mental health services could end all suffering. However, it can greatly improve it. End-of-life care can have outstandingly positive effects on the individual's final days. For me, as an occupational therapy student, it's impossible to engage in this debate without pointing out the adverse ramifications that this has on disabled people. Liz Carr, an actor best known for her role in BBC The Witness and an outspoken opposer of assisted dying, says, "If you saw someone on a bridge about to jump, would you support them in the name of choice? No, you'd probably intervene. But if it was a disabled person, would your response be the same, or would you see it as understandable? Assisted dying exposes vulnerable people to pressure to end their life. There's the moral pressure by elderly relatives, by neglectful or overworked families, a pressure to free up medical resources or lack of support, feelings of being a burden, that this is your only option. Now, here's an advertised and supported system offered by those in white coats you are meant to trust. Something that would have never crossed your mind before suddenly does. This scenario could be very different if the government invested properly, not $7 billion on phone pouches or bike sheds. The situation could be changed by an investment in accessibility. Assistive technology like eye gaze technology and motorized wheelchairs, in carers who are paid well and supported and enabled to do their job and to do it well. Investment in transport so the lifts of the DART or train aren't broken every single day. You could get around independently. You are referred to and seen in a reasonable amount of time to doctors and specialists. Now, assisted dying may never cross your mind. If again, you're thinking that I am being naively optimistic and unrealistic, I ask you again how much trust you have in this government to make the assisted dying system work. In 2016, medical assistance in dying, or MAID, was introduced in Canada and now covers non-terminal cases of unbearable suffering. Non-terminal cases for assisted dying can be granted in 90 days, yet social housing waiting lists can take up to a decade. I've waited longer to see a specialist doctor than I would for an approval from MAID. A Canadian man, Amir Farsood, is a disabled man with chronic back pain who was struggling to survive on benefits and was faced with being homeless again. He believed he had 3 options. 1, magically find a house. 2, kill himself. Or 3, medical assistance in dying. Within 90 days, Amir was approved and would die because he was disabled and poor. I'm not saying every person could get approved this way. Right now, that might just be a privilege awarded to disabled people. Another loophole, Donna Duncan, a psychiatric nurse whose health declined significantly after a concussion. She then began to restrict her diet, leading to malnutrition. And when you're starving yourself, that is not a mental problem, but a physical one. Her daughters argued that it was a mental issue, and that she was a psychiatric nurse, she knew exactly what to say to get approved. She had 2 assessments, one of which was done over the phone, and 48 hours later, she was dead. Perhaps if Donna had received mental health intervention, she would have been here today. Perhaps not. But we will never know if Donna could have lived a happy, content life because she is dead. Disability rights activist Harriet McBride Johnson once said, "When a disabled person wants to die, suddenly it's rational. But when a non-disabled person wants to die, we rush to prevent it." Take, for example, Canada. There is a 24-hour suicide prevention hotline and a 24-hour MAID hotline. Suicide prevention for some, suicide approval for others. This debate isn't just about individual choice. It's about the kind of society we want to create. One where we invest in life, or one where death becomes the default option for the vulnerable. What does it say about our society if we offer death before care and support? Ultimately, for me, this debate comes down to how many people are you okay with dying because of lack of support, inadequate care, coercion, or pressure? What number is it? 1, 100, 1,000? Do you think it is possible that no one will slip through the cracks? What number is it? Because for me, there is only one answer, and that is 0.
Good evening. My name is Tariq. I'm from South Africa, and I'm a human rights barrister, which means that I go to court and dress in fancy robes and pick fights with corporations and annoying governments, and also have the bonus of making no money. But don't tell my Indian parents this. I'm just letting them be happy that they have, an Indian lawyer's son. So I'm leaving it at that for them. I want to focus on 2 things tonight. I'm going to take a slight step back from what's already been discussed and focus on 2 terms. And those terms are legalization, which broadly speaking involves access and oversight and so on to particular services, as is apparent tonight, and of course, dying. I'm not going to spend too much on legalization. I'm going to spend more on the latter. Now, in terms of legalization, we simply mean here that access, as I say, the classic example being access to certain drugs, the way that we deal with alcohol and so on, these things are legalized. Ideally, obviously, in the systems that we're trying to talk about, these also involve controls and they could have measures and oversight. Those are sort of the ideals that we're speaking about now. And obviously, as you've heard all the stats regarding legalized assisted dying, so I'm not going to reiterate those points. Instead, what I want to talk about is dying. Dying implies that you are alive. You have to be alive in order to experience dying. Death is not dying, death is death. And I want you to be aware of when the op speaks about death and dying and speaks about it interchangeably. Be aware of that. That is not what we're speaking. We don't speak about death, we're speaking about dying and the right to die. And importantly, how I also want you to think about dying in terms of living is your mortality is a thread, and ignited on either edge is existence, and they're coming to a head and to a singular point. And that final point is sort of the full stop at let's say, your life sentence. But the point is that mortality is not immortality. It cannot continue to forever. There's going to be a point where you are dying. And my point is that living and dying, well, it's a matter of degree. Dying can be an experience, can be the knowledge of a sudden death, but nevertheless, those are interchangeable. And we want to live in a society, ideally, that promotes a good life, that promotes good living. And by definition, if living and dying are interchangeable, it seems to me that we should want a society that also promotes a dignified dying. Now remember, as I said, not death. Death is not existence, etc. And also, I also want to stress that mere existence isn't particularly special. I don't find mere existence of being alive a particularly wonderful thing. I think most of life is full of suffering and death, and also Elon Musk, who's also from South Africa, so we don't remind me. But living has to be done in and of itself, as I say, is not particularly important. What we want is a life of dignity, one that has reduced suffering, and we would want a society that supports that in its legislation, in its various policies. And if we have a society, and we want such a society that supports active living, that supports dignified living, and if dying is part of living, what would that difference be? How could we not want a society that also supports dignified dying? No, thank you. Now, my opponents have raised very important points pertaining to slippery slopes and coercion and so on, and these are fundamental points, and I cannot dispute, and I won't dispute them. In fact, I embrace them. I think that's very important. And it's important to acknowledge them because this is how we decide policy. It's not ignoring these problems, but engaging with them properly. And that's why I've not located and specified that, for example, Ireland should legalize, or South Africa should legalize. I'm speaking broadly and philosophically about a society that recognizes and legalizes it. What that means in particular, we would have to discuss in very intricate terms, and I will not claim to know or be an expert on Irish policy with regards to this. No, thank you. As such, we must embrace those, and we must engage with them on a fundamental level. However, as I say, my purpose is more broader than that. And if we want a society that supports us and has and must support us in terms of living a dignified and has dignified living, how can we not have one that also supports us in dignified dying? Thank you. Opposed, motion.
This is not a debate about rights. It is not a debate about freedom or choice. It is not even really just a debate about death. This is a debate about states and the actions they take, about us and the society we want to live in, about life, ultimately, and those who will be denied it if this motion fails. Nothing a state does exists in a vacuum. Legalization is not as simple as a piece of paper and a vote and then home in time for tea. The state is the ultimate arbiter, not only of the laws that govern us, but of the underlying beliefs that guide us, not just of what we shouldn't do, but also what we should. When Ireland legalised same-sex marriage, we decided that marriage was an institution for any two people who loved each other, not just a man and a woman. When we criminalised abortion, we decided that a fetus's right to life could not be violated. When we legalised it, we decided that it could. When we joined the European Union, we decided that it would not be Ireland first, but that we had to be part of a greater whole. So you should ask yourselves, when we talk about assisted dying, what exactly are we deciding with this? The opposition tonight stands behind the biggest cultural shift this state, or any state, may ever see. And I realise with an eye to the last 10 years of Irish politics, that sounds like a bold statement. But legalising assisted dying would be a landslide we would never recover from, with ripple effects that we might not even live to see. Overnight, death would go from a worst-case scenario, something which the state is tasked with preventing, to a justifiable and understandable option, to one possibility among many, perhaps even the best option if suffering is unbearable, and if you feel like a burden to your family or to the state. And life, that sacred, no thank you, precious, inviolable thing, would stop being inviolable. That would be a terrible thing. It starts in small ways. Setting aside the media coverage, like in the UK, where MPs talk about the money the NHS would save by doing this, or the lives they think are expendable enough to qualify. It starts with the abolition of the Suicide Act, where the state endeavours to prevent the loss of life by criminalising assisted suicide. With the creation of a new kind of doctor, one who is no longer taught to do no harm, but learns from day one to be an administrator of death. One who no longer considers every patient lost to be a personal failing, but who comes to see the provision of fatal drugs as run-of-the-mill treatment. It starts with a change to our relationship with our doctors, with the state. Under the Assisted Dying Bill in the House of Commons, the topic of assisted dying can be brought up by the patient or by their doctor. You can sit in a room after a terminal cancer diagnosis, scared, alone, grieving the future you should have had, and the next words out of your doctor's mouth can be to suggest the termination of your life. That is where we change our relationship with death on every level. Legalising assisted dying means saying as a state that certain lives are not worth living, and that is a decision we cannot take back. The Rubicon was only a river, but it could not be uncrossed, and it is much the same with this. What is done cannot be undone. This also will lead to an increase in suicides, as it has in every country in the world where assisted dying has been legalised. And please remember that most of these people would not meet the criteria of the terminally ill that some in the opposition wanted to stand over. This goes beyond the existing phenomenon where one person taking their life can be a catalyst for others. Legalisation robs vulnerable people of the most important defence that there is against suicidal ideation, that it is completely unthinkable, completely taboo, and never ever a preferable option to living. Advocates for assisted dying often point to feeling like a burden as a legitimate reason to end your life. Kim Leadmeter in the UK has said it when defending her bill. And I will address this in a moment, but what I want to note is you do not have to be terminally ill to feel like a burden. You do not have to be terminally ill for your suffering to be unbearable. When you spend years on a waiting list to see one psychologist, you feel like a burden. When you cannot get out of bed for weeks, and you are irritable and ungrateful, and you rely on those around you to keep you fed, you feel like a burden. When your anxiety or agoraphobia means you can't go for a casual drink with your friends, or take your boyfriend to his favourite restaurant, or even just be truly present with the people you love, you feel like a burden. When you are bound to a wheelchair and your family always have to call ahead to restaurants to see if they have a ramp, or have to wait for the accessible cab for half an hour longer, you feel like a burden. So when the state tells people that feeling like a burden legitimately tilts the scale in favour of death over life, then we are not just talking to the ill and the dying, we are also talking to them. The idea that you can never kill yourself matters. The stance that every life willfully ended is no less than a tragedy matters. Because in the depths of suicide ideation, that idea is often the last thing to stay a person's hand. Suicide has to never be an option, or else people will take it as one. Black and white stances hold true, even when the rest of the world is dark. And I also think what comes hand in hand with legalising assisted dying is a loss of access to palliative care. And although end-of-life care is imperfect, underfunded, and not everyone's first choice, it still does allow people to die with dignity. There are dedicated teams of compassionate specialists who devote their lives to helping people die well, not in pain, not in discomfort. They ensure that people die with dignity. Today it is the only option. On their world, people would have to opt for it. And although more would choose assisted dying on the opposition side than they can now, I worry that they would do so for the wrong reasons. On both sides, many people will worry about the impact they're having on their loved ones. They will see their husbands walk in the room with puffy eyes, their children defer college another year so they can care for you or pay the costs of your care. I agree, this is an incredible hardship. But not wanting to burden those around you does not mean that you no longer want to be alive. And we see that in the fact that in the face of that hardship, many don't end their lives right now. Even if it is only that they do not want to put their families through that they don't want to add to the pain and grief, they still choose to stay, and they choose palliative care. On opposition, they will not. I think that is a loss. But it would also undercut the already limited funding palliative care receives if it stops being the only treatment option. Of course, state resources would have to be split between that and assisted dying. Of course, lower numbers opting for palliative care would indicate that there is less need for it, that it is less necessary. It is also much more convenient for a state and for doctors if people opt for assisted death. Palliative care costs money, costs resources, costs effort, costs time. In Canada last year, a woman with breast cancer was offered assisted dying, no thank you, before her first mastectomy, before her second mastectomy, and after, in the recovery room, while still in her hospital gown. If you keep asking, then eventually less people will choose palliative care. And if less people do that, then it is easy to reallocate resources. But that doesn't mean it is right. And the biggest difference then is to those who do want to live, who want those few extra months to dull the pain, to hold on long enough to see their kids grow up or graduate or get married. It is their choice that is robbed from them if what limited palliative care is available is taken away more. We should be skeptical of those who choose to die on the opposition side, where the freedom of that choice is in some cases genuinely unclear. But there is no uncertainty here. These are people who would take any treatment, yet will be offered death at every turn, and robbed of the funding they need for the treatment that would help them to survive. Where there is uncertainty, where there is doubt, we must always defer to those who want to live. Legalising assisted dying actively hurts them. This is a debate about life and those who will be denied it. It is about states and the actions that they take. And it is about us, the society we want to be, the one we choose to be, the one that we build. Assisted dying enshrines into law the idea that certain lives are not worth living, that sometimes death is preferable to life, and we can never take that step back. I don't want to live in that world. Do you?
For much of human history, childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a person could go through. If the baby was too big, if something went wrong, there was often no way to keep the mother and the baby both safe throughout the whole process. And even when the C-section, this medical marvel, was discovered, and people knew that this was a fair option for parents and for mothers who had really large babies, it wasn't an option that was exercised a lot because doctors and religious leaders thought that suffering during childbirth was just part of life, and that if a woman couldn't give birth properly, then they didn't deserve, and maybe fate had it in for them to have their life ended. Maybe that was God's plan for them to end, for their life to have ended in that way. So in anesthetics and antiseptics ended up coming along, and people had this other option, a safe way to go through the C-section. The same doctors, the same religious leaders said, no, I don't want to exercise this option, which is why a lot of mothers in the 19th century did end up going through tragic, agonizing pain, end up like dying and seeing their children die as a result of society not keeping up with the way and the new technologies that we ended up developing. There are safe and ethical ways to do this, and I think that the argument that suffering is natural and that dulling the pain is playing God isn't a fair one to have made for the C-sections, just as it might not be particularly apt in the context of this debate. Over time, medicine did catch up with ethics, though. We now understand that C-sections are just a common way to have babies, and no one would force a mother to endure the same sorts of fatal suffering that they did back in the day now, if we know that they have this other option of going through a C-section to have the baby, to let her die in agony when she has a safe alternative. And I think that that's kind of like similar to this whole discussion about assisted dying. Because just like C-sections, assisted dying gives people a way out when society has failed them. 100 years ago, we told women they have no choice but suffering when enduring this sort of childbirth. And in the same way, today, we tell terminally ill patients that they have no choice but to endure watching their bodies atrophy, but to endure the terrible prison that is your own mind if you're in the severe depression and feel like there is no way out, and the government just isn't investing in palliative care or isn't investing in other ways to make the system more safe. History has taught us that when medicine offers us a way to ease suffering, it's a great idea to offer that way to a lot of people. And I think it's a good idea for us to do this. Now, I really, it breaks my heart to think of the arguments and the things that we kind of heard from the proposition. To think that someone would feel so hopeless if you're disabled, if you're in this particular situation, that they would opt into assisted dying in a situation where they might not have otherwise. It really, it sucks to think about that. But it also kind of sucks to think about the other side, right? To think about the same, patient who's suffering from, a severe disorder, who didn't get proper care, proper support, because the palliative care, the healthcare systems in their country just aren't set up. And so they have to live within their own body that they know is only going to get worse and worse. They have to live within these conditions that they only know are going to get worse and worse for the rest of their life. And that is a failure of society. Now, it's just hard to think about that. Like people with late stage ALS when you feel your body atrophying, people who have these late stage cancers when you feel all this pain that we heard about earlier from Owen and from the earlier speakers. And it's really hard to be thinking about thinking about both of these tragedies on both sides of the debate. So the debate then is a question of how best to deal with the tragedies that we're faced with. That there are people that are suffering in these really visceral ways that want this option, and that there also are people who might get pressured into this. And I, might be an optimist, but I, for one, think that there is a line and there is a way for governments to create effective safeguards that give people dignity when they're exercising the choice to decide to use this option. And I think that given that there are, given that, I don't know, maybe I'm an optimist, but given that these options exist, they should be ones that we exercise, and this should be something that's legalized. Because people might decide to go through assisted dying, but they're going to do so with a heavy heart, because it's a hard decision for you to make that I want to end my own life. And so the types of safeguards that I'm talking about are we're going to do things like forcing doctors to, or making sure that doctors have multiple different doctors check in on a particular patient to ensure that no single doctor is pressuring a particular patient to kill themselves, like they have in New Zealand and like they do have in lots of parts of the world. Things like requiring waiting periods for people to wait for months before they actually get assisted dying, so that we know that this is a particular person's choice and it's not that they were forced into doing it by their parents or because they feel like a burden. Things like requiring mental health checks, all things that keep the doctors and the systems in check to make sure that when someone chooses this option, they're doing so with their right intentions in mind. Because assisted dying is a hotly debated issue, because it is something that people care deeply about. You want your family members to die with dignity if they choose this option. Because doctors, I know that people have kind of talked about how doctors pressure people, but doctors, I think, do care deeply about their patients. As we heard from Mr. Ward, that they're in charge of keeping you happy and healthy. And if they feel like this is the only option for you, I think they're probably going to express this to you in a reasonable way. And And so there are reasons to believe that the government is going to preserve dignity and that doctors aren't going to force it onto everyone. And I know that maybe sometimes there are going to be the unfortunate situations, but at the end of the day, we can't walk in other people's shoes. We can't pretend to understand their pain, and by keeping assisted dying illegal, we take the decision away from them. If we legalize it, we aren't forcing it on anyone, we're just giving them the choice, and when people choose it, they'll do so with a heavy heart, but at least they'll be able to decide for themselves. Now, the last thing I'll leave you with is this. If the goal of the proposition is to fix palliative care, it's to fix the healthcare systems that are so broken right now, I don't think the way to do so is by ignoring conversations about death. You know, the reason why the healthcare system is broken, I think everyone has said, you know, we really, really want palliative care to exist, but also palliative care doesn't exist right now, and we really, really want to fix the healthcare system, but it is broken right now. I think the way to fix systems of death and ensure that people die with dignity is to start the conversations around death. It's to do things like bringing conversations about legalizing assisted dying into the DAL so that more people feel less scared about talking about it. You know, yes, Canada might have a broken assisted dying system, or one that people have criticized in the debate, but the fact is, in the 3 years after they legalized assisted dying, they tripled their investments into palliative care, and they created a very robust health system that allowed people to die with dignity in other ways. Maybe some doctors do terrible things, but I have faith in humanity, and I'd like to think that there's a good way to do this policy.
So if people are encouraged after hearing the debate and they want to give a speech of their own, they're welcome to pass down, see if they can with their name and the side they want to be on. To start with, or they can text me on Instagram and I can do that. But to start with, I'd like to go up. Hello, anyone to do a little speech on the proposition. They're 3 minutes in length, so it's a bit short.
Hey, okay, so conveniently I also wrote this speech 3 minutes ago in 3 minutes, so it might not be all 3 minutes. But I came into this debate really thinking that I really agreed with kind of legalizing assisted dying. I am chronically ill. I was diagnosed with a chronic illness when I was 13. If I was ever at a stage where I was suffering continually day after day, there'd be something I maybe want to think of availing of. But then throughout the debate, I heard the arguments in the opposition. I was like, I just fundamentally just disagree with that, because I think Abby's arguments and Amy's arguments were really kind of struck a chord with me. And thinking about kind of disability rights and disabled people, that I just think that you would have people who are pressured into the situation, and that you just can't have them. Going into kind of doctors' clinics since I was 13, I see doctors all the time who just don't care. They're having a busy day. The healthcare system, as we hear in Amy's speech, is just bad. So they're coming in, they've seen 20 patients before you. They don't give a fuck. They're coming in, they're like, okay, what's wrong with you? You don't feel well? They don't care about you. And I think the same principle would be applied. These are the doctors who are dealing with chronically ill people on a day-to-day basis. They dismiss chronically ill patients' kind of concerns and issues. And I think that the same thing would apply on a larger scale when we implement assisted dying. I think they wouldn't take kind of other treatment options into account as much. I think that a lot of things we hear in Amy and Abby's speeches would be true. And then the flip side, I do kind of agree that you shouldn't prolong suffering, and suffering is bad, and you should have the option to end suffering if you are experiencing it. But I just think I really agree with what Amy said, so I'm kind of just repeating the things that you said in your speech. But I think that even one person slipping through the cracks in this system that we'd implement is one person too many. And I think that until you can provide a system that means that you don't have this ever, which I don't think you can, then I just don't think we can we don't live in a world where we can legalize assisted dying, I don't think. And this is kind of mainly based on my experience talking to doctors as a chronically ill person, where they just don't value what you're saying. They don't really care about you that much. You have to really argue and really kind of stand up for what you want to happen. That if a doctor pushed assisted dying onto a chronically ill or terminally ill patient, and they didn't have the kind of wherewithal or the kind of stamina or the strength to really argue their case and really say, no, this is not something I want, this is not something I want to do, which I can see happening, that I just don't think we can live in a world where we legalize that, where we allow that to happen. So while I'm still very conflicted on this motion. Like, I came to the debate with a complete opposite opinion. I think there's a lot of nuance in this that can't be summed up in a 3-minute speech. But I think ultimately that, based on my own experiences and hearing from Abby and Amy as well, and everyone else on the proposition, but you two specifically, I just think that at this moment in time, I don't think we should legalize assisted dying. So yeah, very proud to propose the motion.
Oh, opposition. Looks real different from this side of the table. So I think what I've heard in this debate is, and I feel this, is that there's a problem in the way people think about death and suicide. I think we think it's the worst thing in the world to even believe that it's possible, it's a rational decision to kill yourself, or it's a rational decision to want to die. That's a really hard thing to want to believe. And so therefore, if we make it an ability to be a rational decision, as Martha said, maybe we see it as a thing that we can do in society, and that's fine, and it's past this line. The problem is, and this sounds maybe terrible, but maybe sometimes it is a rational decision, and maybe the only way to acknowledge palliative care, or the only way to try and save people's lives, is to acknowledge that they might be right that they should die, given the conditions they have to live in, and we have to solve those conditions in order to keep them alive. But if we don't consider it a rational decision, if we don't allow people to rationally be able to choose to die, it means that we're not acknowledging the fact that some conditions can be so bad to live in that it's worth dying. What I mean by this is that throughout the debate, we've kind of talked about, if you rationalize it, if you let people choose, then they might make that decision. And it kind of means that you actually lose their ability. We're saying that people should impose death on themselves. Their conditions are so bad. I think what we're saying is we're acknowledging that some people's conditions are so bad in reality, right? Because the conditions exist for everyone. We're acknowledging that these conditions are so bad for some people, and maybe it's the right choice for them. And it's only the right choice for them if they make that choice. No one and I agree there's minutiae in the legislation and things like that. That should be discussed. But no one on the opposition tonight, or no one really who's in favour of assisted dying, is ever saying that it shouldn't be their choice. What we're saying is that to allow it to be a choice allows for you to deal with the conditions. What this then means is that I think, Rayhan had this stat about Canada increasing spending on palliative care. But I do just think that when we realise that death can be a choice and it can be rational, the types of response to people who feel like they want to die are actually about helping their lives get better. I don't think that the taboo around death is really going to change. People are obviously going to be incredibly sad when their loved ones die. Obviously, people really don't want this to happen. So the difference is, when we say basically you can't die, we don't really have to necessarily as a society do things to solve the death, because they're just irrational. They're just getting it wrong, and if we do enough therapy or we fix their brain in a certain way, then they will change their mind and they will be correct and they'll start thinking rationally again. I think that kind of thinking is quite damaging, and I think maybe the better solution is, maybe they're right, maybe their life is so bad, maybe we should try and change their life rather than limiting their ability to have that autonomy. That's why I ideologically strongly believe this. I also think, just a comment, is that when assisted dying is legalized, sure, there are probably examples, we talked about Canada a lot, but the criticism of these policies and the criticism of is exactly the example of, we don't actually want to see a death cult society, we don't want to see loads of deaths happen, so there will be criticism of deaths increasing. It's just, it gives people the ability to realize that they're not just irrational, that the world isn't different, that their experience of the world is valid, and if they want to die, maybe that's a valid feeling. We should solve the conditions, and therefore, I think allowing assisted dying would be good. Cool. I've got one more floor speech that's just been texted in. So yeah, Mary, if you want to come up and do the floor speech.
So this is really short. I just have 2 points. Throughout this debate, I was reminded a lot of the trolley problem, because I think this is what we get from a lot of proposition, which is that they believe that this suffering matters, but they think the point is that the state shouldn't be the one that moves the lever. Their problem isn't necessarily that everyone's acknowledging their suffering. They're saying the moral bad is when the state makes a choice, and that it is better to sit and watch more people get hit than turn the lever and hit less people. I think that is the argument, and I'm seeing nodding on side propositions, so I'll take that as I'm not misrepresenting their case. And I think that's a little flawed. And what I would ask them is, if they were a doctor in an emergency room, would you follow a do not resuscitate order? Because the state says you have to. And a do not resuscitate order is pretty much the same thing. It is someone saying that they do not want to be saved. That in this condition that is killing them, that they do not want to be saved. And I think that if Proposition wants to stand over their side, which I think is incredibly valid, they have to stand over the fact that someone signing a document that says, do not resuscitate me, is something that the state can't listen to. They say that the state won't value disabled people less. I think that when I consider me and whether or not the state values me, I consider whether or not the state cares what I think, not whether or not the state cares that I'm breathing.
I'm going to call a vote in the House. So I'll say all those in favour of the motion, you say aye, and then you say aye, and then those opposed, you say nay, and then you say nay, and then those opposed. So on the motion, this House opposes the legalisation of assisted dying. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those opposed, please say nay. Nay.